The scent of lemon and ammonia was Nia's shield. As long as she was cleaning, she was invisible. A ghost in a gray uniform, pushing a cart of chemical solutions and microfiber cloths through the empty, echoing halls of the Tanaka Global Headquarters. Tonight, her route ended here, on the 88th floor. The penthouse office. His office. She worked with a meticulous rhythm born of desperation. Each swipe of her cloth across the vast obsidian desk was a prayer that her landlord would accept half the rent tomorrow. Each spritz of glass cleaner on the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Shinjuku was a hope that her check for this job would clear in time. She was 18, and her world had shrunk to the size of an overdue notice taped to her apartment door. This office was different from the others. It was less a place of business and more a shrine to a man she had never met. A single, perfect bonsai tree sat in an alcove. The books on the shelves were not for show. Their spines were cracked, the pages worn. Everything was black, chrome, or the deep, rich brown of polished mahogany. It was a room that held its breath. Her job was to erase any trace of human presence, to polish away fingerprints, vacuum footprints, and empty the single wastebasket that rarely held more than a few crumpled papers. The cleaning service she worked for had strict rules for this floor. In by midnight, out by 2. Never touch the computer. Never open a drawer. Never exist. Tonight, the silence felt heavier. A storm was rolling in, the sky over Tokyo a bruised purple. Nia focused on the desk, her movements economical. She wiped down the keyboard, the monitor's base, the smooth, cool surface of the desk itself. As she reached to polish the silver mouse, her hand bumped it. The massive screen, a wall of dormant black, flickered to life. Nia froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Don't look. Just turn it off. But she couldn't. The screen showed a stark, concrete room. A man was tied to a metal chair, his face swollen and bloody. He was gagged. The video feed was live, the timestamp in the corner blinking in stark red. She saw the tremor in the man's bound hands. A voice, distorted and cold, spoke from the computer's speakers, a language she didn't understand. But the tone was universal. It was the sound of a verdict being delivered. Before she could process what she was seeing, before she could even recoil, a different sound cut through the room. The soft, almost silent whoosh of the private elevator door. She ducked behind the enormous desk, her breath catching in her throat. Her cart, left near the door, was a dead giveaway. She was caught. All she could think about was losing this job, the only thing keeping a roof over her head. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossed the marble floor. They stopped. A profound silence descended, thick with menace. She heard the soft clink of her cart being nudged. He knew someone was here. Slowly, she peered around the edge of the desk. She saw only his shoes first. Impossibly shiny black leather, so polished they reflected the dim city lights like pools of oil. Then the sharp crease of his dark trousers. He stood perfectly still, a predator sensing a disturbance in its territory. Nia's gaze traveled up, past a tailored suit jacket that was clearly custom-made, over broad shoulders, to a face carved from shadow and discipline. It was him, Kaito Tanaka. She had only seen him in a single photo in the lobby, a black and white portrait where he looked more like a concept than a man. In person, he was terrifyingly real. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room, missing nothing. They swept past her hiding spot, then snapped back, locking onto the glowing monitor. He moved then, not with haste but with a chilling surgical precision. He rounded the desk. Nia scrambled back, pressing herself against the cold leather of the guest chairs. There was nowhere to run. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the screen. He saw the live feed, the bound man, the blinking red light. Then his eyes lowered. They found her. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at her, huddled on the floor, a girl in a cheap, ill-fitting uniform who had seen something that could get them both killed. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold control. But she saw a flicker in the depths of his eyes. Not anger.
Surprise.
As if he'd found a stray cat curled up on his throne. Who let you in here? His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floor. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Nia couldn't find her voice. Her tongue felt thick, her throat tight with fear. She just stared up at him, this man who moved like the world owed him space, who controlled the brutal scene playing out on his computer screen. He took a single step closer. He reached out, not for her, but for the mouse. With one deliberate click, the video feed vanished, plunging the room back into near darkness, lit only by the stormy sky. He didn't look at her again. He walked to the office door, his movements fluid and unnervingly calm. He spoke into a small device on his wrist. The words were Japanese, quiet and clipped. Final. A moment later, the door clicked shut. An electronic lock word, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Nia pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling for the handle. It didn't budge. She was locked in. She turned. Kaito Tanaka was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city that was his kingdom. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened her. He had simply claimed the room, and her with it. She was no longer an invisible cleaner. She was a witness. And in his world, she knew witnesses didn't have a long life expectancy. The silence stretched, and Nia understood. This was no longer an office. It was a cage. The first 12 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. He never spoke to her. He never even looked at her. He made a series of quiet phone calls, his voice a low, controlled murmur. Men in dark suits came and went, bowing slightly as they entered and exited through the private elevator he now controlled. They brought him files, a tablet, a fresh shirt. They looked at Nia with cold, dismissive eyes, as if she were a piece of furniture he'd inexplicably rearranged. She stayed huddled in the leather guest chairs, her cleaning cart a pathetic monument to her former life. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but fear was a stronger appetite. She watched him, because there was nothing else to do. She saw the intricate dragon tattoo peeking from beneath his crisp white cuff, a flash of blue and black ink against his skin. She noticed the way he held his hands, perfectly still on the desk, unless he was making a point. Then, a single finger would tap, a gesture that seemed to command more authority than a shouted order. His power wasn't loud. It was absolute. Late in the afternoon, one of his men brought in a tray of food. Exquisite, fragrant dishes she couldn't name. He ate alone at his desk, his movements precise. He left the tray on a side table. Hours passed. Nia's stomach cramped. Finally, when he was on a call, his back to her, she crept over. Her hands shook as she picked up a piece of grilled fish with the abandoned chopsticks. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, guilt and gratitude warring within her. She was a prisoner eating her captor's leftovers. That night, he gestured to the long leather sofa against one wall. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was a command. Nia lay down, curling into a tight ball, feigning sleep. The room was dark, save for the glow of his monitor. She watched the sliver of light under her lashes. She saw him finally lean back in his chair, the rigid control of his posture slackening for the first time. He opened a drawer and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it he slid a photograph. It was old, the edges soft with time. A young woman with a bright, fearless smile. He stared at it for a long, silent time. Nia saw his thumb stroke the edge of the photo, a gesture of such profound, unguarded tenderness that it felt like a violation to witness. The mask of the Yakuza boss fell away, and for a single, shattering moment, she saw only a man drowning in a sea of grief. A deep, abyssal shame radiated from him, so potent it seemed to suck the air from the room. He had failed this woman. Nia knew it as surely as she knew her own name. This was his wound. This was the ghost that haunted the penthouse with her. The next day, the war came to them. It started with a tremor that shook the building, a low boom from floors below. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the stark, flashing red of the emergency system. An automated voice, calm and feminine, announced a security breach. Kaido was on his feet in an instant. He moved not with panic, but with the lethal grace of a panther. He grabbed Nia by the arm, his grip like steel. "Stay with me. Do not make a sound." He pulled her toward a section of the library wall. He pressed a book, a worn copy of the Book of Five Rings, and the entire bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. Gunshots echoed from the hallway, muffled but unmistakable. Smoke began to curl under the main office door, the acrid smell burning Nia's throat. Inside the passage, it was pitch black and tight. He crowded her against the wall, his body a shield in front of hers. She could feel the heat of him, the solid wall of his chest against her back. His breath was warm on her neck as he whispered, "They are faster than I expected." Through a tiny slit in the wall, they could see into the office. Two men in tactical gear smashed through the glass of the main door. They swept the room, weapons raised. They were professionals. One of them spotted her cleaning cart and kicked it over, sending bottles of chemicals skittering across the floor. Suddenly, the building's fire suppression system kicked in. Halon gas hissed from vents in the ceiling, a thick white cloud flooding the office. Alarms blared. Amid the chaos, Nia saw it, a secondary emergency exit on the far side of the room, its light now glowing green. It was her chance, her one and only chance. Kaido was distracted, watching the intruders, his body tense. She could slip away in the confusion. She could run. Her heart screamed at her to go, survive. But as she started to ease away, he let out a sharp, muffled hiss of pain. She looked down. In the dim emergency light filtering through the vent, she saw a dark stain spreading across the side of his white shirt. A piece of shrapnel from the door frame had torn through the fabric and into his side. He pressed a hand to it, his jaw tight, trying to hide it. She saw the open door. She saw freedom. And she saw him, bleeding in the dark, the man who had imprisoned her, the man with the ghost in his eyes. She made her choice. Instead of running, she reached into the deep pocket of her uniform where she kept a small, personal first aid kit for the nicks and cuts of her job. She pulled out a packet of sterile gauze. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "You're bleeding." He turned his head, his dark eyes widening in surprise as he saw the gauze in her hand. The emergency exit was still open. The path to her old life was right there. But she was still here, with him. "Hold still," she whispered and pushed past him, back into the now empty office, pulling him into the relative safety of a small server closet. The air was thick with chemical fog. She pushed his jacket aside and pressed the gauze to the wound. He flinched, his breath sharp. They were so close she could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, now tainted with the metallic tang of blood. He stared down at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something else she couldn't name. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice rough. "Why didn't you run?" Nia didn't look up from her task, her focus absolute. "They would have found me," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. The truth was far more complicated, a knot of instinct and a terrifying flicker of empathy she refused to acknowledge. "And you're no good to me, Dad." The immediate threat passed. Kaido's men, efficient and brutal, handled the breach. But the atmosphere in the penthouse had irrevocably shifted. He no longer ignored her. He watched her. When she moved through the office, tidying the mess from the attack, his eyes followed her. He saw her, not as a piece of the scenery, but as an anomaly he couldn't solve. The rival clan, the Gorokai, now knew she existed. They had failed to get to him, so they would try to get to her. A few days later, the proof arrived. Kaido was in a meeting with his top lieutenants when his head of security entered, his face grim. He placed a tablet on the desk. On the screen was a grainy surveillance photo. It was Nia, from a week ago, leaving her apartment building. A red circle was drawn around her face. Kaido's jaw tightened. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He dismissed his men with a flick of his wrist. The silence that remained was heavy and dangerous. He knew what this meant. They thought she was his lover, his weakness. A lever to use against him. The next attempt came, without warning. He had allowed her a small concession, An hour on the rooftop garden, flanked by 2 guards. It was the first fresh air she'd had in days. As she was admiring the meticulously raked patterns in a Zen garden, a maintenance elevator on the far side of the roof pinged open. It wasn't supposed to be in service. 2 men rushed out. They weren't soldiers. They were kidnappers. They moved fast. Her guards reacted instantly, placing themselves between her and the threat, but one of the intruders was faster. He lunged for her. A hand snaked out, grabbing her arm. Nia screamed, a raw, terrified sound. Then, Kaito was there. He had come from the main elevator, moving with a speed that was inhuman. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He became an instrument of pure violence. He broke the arm of the man holding her with a single, sickening crack of bone. He disarmed the other with a fluid motion, using the man's own knife against him. It was over in seconds. It was balletic, terrifying, and ruthlessly efficient. He stood over the 2 men, his chest rising and falling, the only sign of his exertion. His face was a mask of cold fury. He turned to Nia, his eyes scanning her for injury. He saw the red marks on her arm where the man had grabbed her. He saw the terror in her eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was the one who had been struck. The near loss of her had cracked his composure. He reached out, as if to touch her, then curled his hand into a fist at his side. He had almost failed to protect someone again. The shame was a shadow in his eyes. That night, they brought one of the captured men to the office. They tied him to the same chair from a video feed. Kaito conducted the interrogation himself. The man was defiant, spitting blood on the marble floor. He sneered at Kaito. "You're getting soft, Tanaka. Hiding behind a little foreign girl. Is she your new good luck charm? What happened to the last one? The one you let die?" Kaito's control snapped. He backhanded the man, a sharp, cracking sound that made Nia flinch from where she watched in the doorway. But the man just laughed, a gurgling sound. He knew he had hit the nerve, the wound. Kaito was losing. His anger was making him blind. Nia watched, her heart pounding. And then a memory surfaced. A piece of gossip she'd overheard from another cleaner, whose cousin ran with a low-level Gorokai crew. Something about this man, this interrogator's right hand. Something about a sister. She walked into the room. The guards tensed. Kaito turned, his eyes burning with a dark fire, warning her away. She ignored him. She walked right up to the bound man, who looked at her with contempt. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "I hear your sister enjoys her classes at the university. The art history program. It would be a shame if her tuition suddenly became a problem." It was a complete bluff. A cold, calculated guess. But it landed. The man's sneer vanished. The color drained from his face. He stared at her, his bravado crumbling into raw fear. He had a weakness, too. A sister he was trying to protect, to give a better life. Nia had just threatened to burn that life to the ground. She felt a wave of nausea at what she had done. She had used the enemy's tactics. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. The man broke. He told them everything. The names, the locations, the plans. After the guards dragged him away, she and Kaito were left alone in the silent office. The smell of blood and fear lingered in the air. Nia stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling dirty. He came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, a formidable presence in the dark. "You shouldn't know how to do that," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of judgment. "You learn things," she replied, her voice hollow. "When you have nothing, you learn to see what people value, what they're afraid to lose." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the distant hum of the city. He was looking at her. She could feel it. Not with the cold assessment of before, but with a new, unsettling intensity. "For 10 years, he said, his voice a low confession aimed at the glass. "I have lived in this fortress. I built it so nothing and no one could ever get in again. I never considered what it would feel like to want someone to stay. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was an admission that she had breached a wall far more formidable than the ones made of steel and concrete. She was the crack in his armor. And the Gorokai knew it too. The next day, a message arrived for Kaido. It was a single photo, sent to his private number. A picture of her small, run-down apartment building, the one with the overdue rent notice still taped to the door. The message was brutally simple. We can erase her world, and then we will erase her. The final move was made. The Gorokai leader, a man named Ryuichi, proposed a meeting. A truce, he called it. At a neutral location, a closed restaurant in Ginza. He had two conditions. Kaido had to come alone, and he had to bring the girl. Ryuichi wanted to see the Yakuza boss's supposed weakness for himself, to parade her as a trophy before finishing him. Kaido agreed. His plan was simple and suicidal. He would go, but Nia would be secured in a panic room deep beneath the Tanaka building. He was going to the meeting to die, taking Ryuichi and his inner circle with him in a final, explosive act. It wasn't strategy. It was atonement. For the woman in the photograph. For letting Nia get dragged into this. But Nia had not survived this long by being passive. While he prepared for his death, she planned for their survival. In her weeks of captivity, she had watched. She had learned. She knew the guards' shift patterns, the slight hesitation in the security chief's eyes, the access codes he punched in just a little too slowly. She was no longer invisible because she was a cleaner. She was invisible because they underestimated her. She found Kaido's most trusted lieutenant, a stoic older man named Hideo, in a quiet hallway. She didn't plead or cry. She spoke to him as an equal. He's going there to die, she said, her voice firm. You know it. It's not about protecting the clan. It's about his pride, his shame. And when he's gone, Ryuichi will tear this family apart looking for me. Hideo's face remained a stone mask, but his eyes flickered. She had his attention. I have what the prisoner told us, she continued, pressing her advantage. I know about Ryuichi's deal with the Chinese. The one he's hiding from his own people. Let me go with him. I can be a better weapon than any gun you give him. She went. When she walked out of the elevator to meet Kaido, dressed not in her uniform but in a simple, dark dress Hideo had provided, he looked at her as if he'd seen a ghost. The fury and betrayal in his eyes were terrible to behold. I commanded you to stay, he hissed, his voice dangerously low. And I chose not to obey, she answered, her chin high. You don't get to die for me. I won't be your penance. The restaurant was a cavern of tense silence. Ryuichi sat at the head of a long table, flanked by his men. He was a snake, all smiles and false cordiality. He looked Nia up and down, a leering, possessive gaze. So, he said, this is the creature that brought the great Kaido Tanaka to heel. Kaido's hand twitched, but Nia laid a calming hand on his arm, a small gesture of command that stunned him into stillness. She looked directly at Ryuichi, her gaze unwavering. You wanted me here, she said, her voice clear and steady. But you've made a mistake. You think I'm his weakness. You're wrong. I'm his memory. Ryuichi laughed. What is that supposed to mean? It means I know about the shipments at the Yokohama port, Nia said, her voice dropping. The ones you're not logging. The ones your partners in Shanghai would be very interested to know you've been skimming from. The ones your own clan would consider a deep betrayal. The air crackled. Ryuichi's smile evaporated. His men shifted, looking at their boss with new, uncertain eyes. She had planted the seed of doubt. She had used information not as a hammer, but as a poison. That was the opening Kaido needed. The moment of hesitation was all it took. The truce exploded into a whirlwind of violence. But this time, the odds were different. Ryuichi's men were divided, their trust in their leader shattered. In the chaos, a loyalist lunged for Kaido from his blind side. Nia saw it coming. She didn't think. She acted. She shoved Kaido with all her might, pushing him out of the path of the swinging blade. The steel sliced across her upper arm, a line of searing, white-hot pain. She cried out, stumbling back, clutching the wound as blood welled up, dark and hot against her skin. The fight was over as quickly as it began. Kaido stood amidst the wreckage, a king surveying his bloody victory. He ignored the groaning men, the shattered tables, the dead. He turned and saw her, leaning against a wall, her face pale, her arms soaked in blood. He crossed the room in 3 strides. The world seemed to fall away until it was only the two of them. Gently, he took off his Tom Ford suit jacket, the one that probably cost more than she'd ever earned, and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm and smelled of him, sandalwood, smoke, and victory. He cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, his touch surprisingly gentle. The cold mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw the ruins of his fortress, and her, standing in the middle of it all. "You are not my weakness," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't dare to name. "You are my reason." He didn't need to say more. He swept her up into his arms, holding her against his chest as if she were the most precious thing in his world, and carried her out of the carnage. Weeks later, the city was quiet. The Goro Kai was broken, absorbed into his empire. Nia stood on the balcony of the penthouse, a silk robe soft against her skin. The deep gash on her arm had healed into a thin, pale scar, a permanent reminder of the line she had crossed. Her old life, the girl with the cleaning cart and the overdue rent, was a ghost. She heard him approach, felt his presence behind her like a change in the atmosphere. He didn't touch her, but stood so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He placed a delicate porcelain cup of steaming green tea on the balcony railing beside her hand. "Your rent is paid," he said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "For as long as you wish to stay." The words hung in the cool night air. It wasn't a question of love or forever. It was a statement of fact, an offering. Freedom, of a sort, within the gilded cage. She looked out at the endless sea of lights that was Tokyo, a world that had tried to swallow her whole. Then she turned her head, her eyes meeting his in the reflection of the glass. The city lights swam in their dark depths.
She didn't speak. She didn't need to.
Nia simply reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the cool metal railing. A silent answer.
A choice.
And in the quiet of the 88th floor, that was enough.